There is a moment in the original Star Wars trilogy that most people remember wrong. You probably think of it as a story about hope, a scrappy rebellion against a faceless empire. But look closer at what actually starts the war. Not tyranny, not oppression, a tax dispute, a trade route, a corporation with its own army. The galaxy far, far away isn't just a backdrop for lightsaber fights. It is a complete economic system with its own banks, monopolies, reserve currencies, and corporate capture. And the more you understand how that system works, the more it stops looking like science fiction. Let's start where every economy starts, with geography. The core worlds sit at the center of the galaxy, wealthy, connected, politically powerful. But the real resources, spice, fuel, raw ore, those come from the edges, from the outer rim. And here's the thing about the outer rim. It is extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily poor at the same time. Economists have a name for this phenomenon. They call it the resource curse, the counterintuitive pattern where resource-rich regions end up poorer and more unstable than regions with almost nothing. The wealth gets extracted, the profits flow outward. The locals get left with the hole in the ground. You can see it in real history. You can also see it on Tatooine. Tatooine is not a poor planet because it has nothing. It is poor because what it has is controlled by someone else. Jabba the Hutt doesn't just run a criminal enterprise, he runs an economy. The spice trade, the slave markets, the smuggling routes, all of it flows through him. He is functionally the government, and no one elected him. That's the outer rim in miniature, when there is no legitimate government to collect taxes, enforce contracts, or protect workers. Private power fills the gap. Sometimes it's a crime lord, sometimes it's a corporation, and sometimes, as we'll see, it's both at the same time. Now here's where the money really lives. Before the Empire, before the Clone Wars, there was a galaxy-spanning bank. The InterGalactic Banking Clan operated from a world called Moonilinst, controlled by an alien species called the Moon, who had turned finance into a civilization. They weren't just a bank. They were the bank. The institution that financed governments, armies, and corporations across the known galaxy. During the Clone Wars, the IGBC financed both the Republic and the Separatists simultaneously. They charged the Republic interest on the loans used to grow the clone army. They helped fund the corporate coalition fighting against that same Republic. They had a formal policy, a so-called neutrality doctrine, that made this not just acceptable, but by design. War, to the IGBC, was not a catastrophe. It was a revenue stream. The clones dying on both sides of every battlefield were, in a very real sense, collateral for someone else's loan portfolio. The IGBC didn't care who won. They cared about repayment. And they knew that whoever won would inherit the debt. This is not a fantasy. Central banks and international lenders have financed both sides of real conflicts throughout history. The mechanism is the same. When you control the money supply, you don't need to pick sides. You own the outcome regardless. Now let's talk about the Separatists, because they are one of Star Wars' most misunderstood factions. The Confederacy of Independent Systems presents itself as a populist uprising, planets breaking free from a corrupt, bloated republic. And that framing isn't entirely wrong. The republic was corrupt, the Senate was dysfunctional, but the CIS wasn't a grassroots movement. It was a corporate merger. The IGBC, the Trade Federation, the Commerce Guild, these were the entities that funded and organized the separatist cause. The CIS was, at its core, a corporate-funded state built to protect trade interests from taxation. The people living on those separatist planets thought they were getting liberation. What they were actually getting was a new set of corporate landlords with a droid army. The Trade Federation fielded an entirely privately owned military to enforce its commercial interests. Let that sink in. A corporation with its own invasion force. Not contracted, not borrowed, owned. When trade negotiations failed on Naboo, they didn't send lawyers. They sent battleships. The Trade Federation blockaded Naboo over a taxation dispute on interstellar trade routes. That's the inciting event of the entire prequel trilogy. Not an assassination, not a coup. A disagreement about who gets to collect tariffs on cargo moving through space. The entire Clone Wars, trillions of lives, the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, has a tax invoice at its origin. Why couldn't the Republic just impose the tax? Because it couldn't. The Republic's core political dysfunction was its inability to effectively tax or regulate the trade routes that were the lifeblood of the galactic economy. The Senate was full of trade bloc representatives whose entire political identity was protecting their commercial patrons. You couldn't reform the system from inside because the system had already been purchased. Economists and political scientists call this corporate capture, when private interests gain enough influence over government institutions that the government begins to serve those interests rather than the public. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like a takeover. It looks like procedural delays, blocked votes, committees that never meet. The Republic wasn't conquered by corporations. It was hollowed out by them slowly over centuries. And into that hollowed out institution stepped one man with a plan. Palpatine's genius, and this is genuinely worth studying, wasn't military. It was financial. He understood that a government in debt, fighting a war it can't afford, will hand power to whoever promises to manage the crisis. He manufactured the conditions for emergency. And then he offered himself as the solution. The declaration of the Empire wasn't a dramatic military coup. It was a budget meeting that went badly for democracy. Palpatine used the financial architecture of the Clone Wars, the debts, the military contracts, the emergency spending, to make the Senate irrelevant. By the time he declared himself emperor, the Senate wasn't resisting. They were applauding. So, what does an empire actually cost? A researcher named Zachary Feinstein ran the numbers on the Death Star, the Empire's ultimate power projection weapon. His estimate for just the second Death Star, 419 quintillion US dollars equivalent. That is a number so large it has no human reference point. It is not a budget line. It is an entire civilization's productive output, weaponized. To put that in some kind of perspective, the entire economic output of planet Earth in a year is roughly $100 trillion. The Death Star cost more than 4 million years of Earth's total production. The Empire wasn't just building a weapon. It was concentrating every unit of economic value in the galaxy into a single object designed to enforce obedience through fear. And when that object was destroyed twice, what happened to the economy that built it? Feinstein modeled this too. The post-Endor imperial financial collapse, he argued, resembled a galactic-scale bank run. Imagine every investor in the galaxy simultaneously deciding that imperial bonds, imperial contracts, and imperial currency are worthless. That's not just political change. That's the overnight evaporation of a civilization's financial system. A bank run, for anyone who needs the reference. It's when everyone tries to withdraw their money at once and the institution collapses because it was never holding all that money in reserve. Multiply that by a galaxy. The New Republic didn't just inherit a war, they inherited a financial crater. But let's pull back for a second, because one of the most revealing details in all of Star Wars happens not in a Senate chamber or a Death Star throne room. It happens in a junkyard on a desert planet when a 9-year-old boy's master tries to buy spaceship parts. Watto, the Toydarian junk dealer on Tatooine, refuses Republic credits. Just like that. He doesn't argue about them, he dismisses them. This is a story about reserve currency, and it's one of the sharpest pieces of economic world building in the entire saga. A reserve currency is the currency that everyone accepts because everyone else accepts it. The US dollar works this way because global oil is priced in dollars. because most international contracts are denominated in dollars because the trust is self-reinforcing. But that trust is not permanent. Watto's refusal tells you something profound about the Republic's actual reach. All the Senate speeches, all the trade regulations, all the political theater, none of it means anything past a certain point in the galaxy. The Galactic Credit Standard was a core world's institution. Out here, it was just a coin with a dead senator's face on it. Power in the Outer Rim ran on different currencies. Coaxium, the fuel that makes hyperspace travel possible, was perhaps the most fundamental. Think of coaxium the way we think of oil. Every ship, every trade route, every military operation requires it. Control the coaxium and you don't need an army. You just need to be the only person who can open the gate. And then there's Beskar, Mandalorian iron. The Empire didn't just conquer Mandalore. They strip-mined it. They extracted the Beskar as colonial tribute, turning a cultural material, something Mandalorians used as armor, as inheritance, as identity, into imperial war material. This is resource extraction as cultural erasure. The economics and the violence are the same act. Beskar functions within Mandalorian society as something closer to gold than to steel. It stores value, it signals status, it passes between generations as a form of wealth that survives political catastrophe. When a Mandalorian receives a Beskar ingot, they're not just getting paid, they're being reconnected to something that was taken from them. That's what money can be, at its most human. Now consider the supply chains. Hyperspace travel runs on coaxium. Coaxium and spice come significantly from Kessel, and Kessel's mines ran on slave labor, first under private corporate management, then under the Empire, with only the names on the ledger changing. The people in the mines stayed the same. The Pike Syndicate controlled the trafficking routes from Kessel, functioning as a narco cartel, an organization that profits from the movement of restricted commodities by maintaining violent control over the distribution network. The spice trade follows the same logic as real-world drug cartels. The product is valuable precisely because it's restricted, and the restriction is enforced by whoever has the most ruthless security apparatus. And speaking of security apparatus, in Andor, the series that takes Star Wars most seriously as political drama, we see something remarkable. The planet Ferrix is governed not by an imperial governor, not by a local authority, but by a corporation called Preox Morlana, a private company running a planet, collecting taxes, deploying police, deciding what the law is. This is not science fiction hyperbole. The East India Company governed large parts of South Asia. The Hudson's Bay Company controlled territories larger than modern Europe. The logic of outsourcing sovereignty to corporations is deeply historical, and Andor makes you feel the weight of it, not through policy debate, but through the experience of people who just want to know who exactly they're supposed to appeal to when the company does something wrong. The answer, of course, is no one. That's the point. Up in orbit, meanwhile, someone has to build the ships. Kuat Drive Yards held something close to a monopoly on Imperial Star Destroyer production. One company, one product line, the backbone of Imperial military power, and Kuat's political influence over the Senate operated exactly the way real defense contractors influence real legislatures, through economic dependency, through employment in key districts, through the simple fact that the people voting on procurement were the same people whose constituents built the ships. Real-world arms companies generated nearly $600 billion in revenue in a single year, according to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The incentive to keep building, to keep selling, to keep the conflict going is not incidental to the weapons industry. It is structural. So step back. Look at the full picture now. The Outer Rim bleeds resources upward. Banks profit from both sides of every war. Corporations buy their way into legislatures. Private companies replace governments. Reserve currencies enforce hierarchies of power across entire regions. And the people at the bottom, the slaves in the spice mines, the workers on Ferrix, the child in the junkyard who can't go home because his master owns him, they experience all of this not as economics, but as the fixed conditions of their lives. This is what makes Star Wars at its best something more than adventure fiction. It is a map of how power actually works, not the dramatic version with lightsabers and throne room confrontations. The quiet version, the version where a tax vote that nobody remembers sets off a war that kills millions, where a bank's neutrality policy means the bank always wins, where a child is property because the currency that might buy his freedom isn't accepted this far from the center. Remember that moment at the beginning. The thing most people think started Star Wars. The rebellion, the hope, the princess, and the farm boy. But now you know what was underneath all of it. A trade route, a tax, a corporation that decided its profit margin was worth more than the sovereignty of a planet. The empire wasn't an aberration. It was an institution that grew naturally from an economic system that had already decided some lives were inputs and others were investors. That's the single idea at the heart of everything we've just explored. Political power and economic power are not separate forces. They are the same force wearing different clothes depending on who's in the room. The Death Star is just a budget line that got out of hand. And maybe that's the thing you carry out of this. Not the numbers, not the lore, but the recognition. The next time you see a story about a blocked vote, or a private contractor governing a public space, or a currency that only works in certain neighborhoods, you'll have a frame for it. You saw it first in a galaxy far, far away, and it looked exactly like here.